Well, good morning. We're continuing on our series called The God Factor, Can Science and Religion Coexist? And I just want to remind everyone of our disclaimer. You know the disclaimer? Is everybody familiar with my disclaimer? Matt is not a scientist, right? Are we all good about that? Can I get an amen here this morning? So not everything I say is 100% accurate all the time, because I'm not a scientist. Also, the things that I share about from the scientific side of things is debatable. I'm also going to share a little bit about Genesis and an interpretation of Genesis this morning that is also debatable. So there are different schools of thought, different ways of looking at both science and theology. So I just want to make you aware that there are other people in the scientific community and the theological community who would see things probably differently than I do. And one of the things I've learned is that I'm just kind of a lifelong learner. And I just love learning about things and then sharing with other people like you what I learn and what God may be up to in the world. And so that's what I'm doing this morning. And it's very hard for us. The other thing about it is very hard to get everything into a 20-minute message. Does that make? I mean, there's so much out there theologically. There's so much out there in the scientific field that I can't possibly explain everything in the detail that would be required or that I could even understand sometimes to get across what we're talking about. So I'm just hitting kind of the tip of the iceberg on a lot of these things, but hopefully that'll hopefully be encouraging to you this morning. Now let's go back to science class. Everybody ready to go back to science class this morning? Yeah, you're like, no, I didn't come here for science, right? Well, we're going to go back. You may recall, if back in high school or back in college, learning about an experiment done by a gentleman named Stanley Miller. And Stanley Miller was actually based on another idea from another scientist named Urey. And Stanley Miller designed this experiment in his laboratory, trying to recreate the early Earth's atmosphere and trying to figure out how did we go from, the universe, which we talked about last week, inorganic matter, energy, matter, light. How do we go from there to life? And so scientists have been trying to answer this question. And so Stanley Miller came up with this experiment. It's written about in many of our textbooks in college and in high school. And he created in his laboratory this simulation of the Earth's atmosphere along with H2O, water, which we know is a requirement for life, and then some other substances within the atmosphere. Then he ran electricity through this experiment that he has come up with. So you've got a couple flasks, and then you introduce electricity because he figured there was lightning in the early stages of the birth of the Earth. And so if you introduce lightning and electricity, they would do something to these molecules and in the atmosphere and the water, and that somehow life would occur. And so he did this experiment, and he let it run for about a week. And at the end of the week, when he began to study what happened, he found that there were 20 amino acids that were produced through this process. And so the amino acids are organic matter and required to build proteins and to build life, and one of the building blocks of life. And so this was found, and so everybody thought, aha, we've discovered how we got from inorganic, non-life, to life. And so that got put in our textbooks. Now, later scientists have looked at this, and it's become a very debatable subject as to whether or not this was a good experiment. It showed promise, and it was certainly something that was very good for us to practice and to begin to understand and kind of close the gap on what science was seeing. But the reality is, later science says we still really don't know how this happened. That there were flaws in Miller's experiment that we can't account for, and we really don't know a lot of things. And so we're actually left with more questions about the origins of life on the planet than we have answers now today. Because as science has progressed and learned more, we look at that experiment now. Science looks at the experiment and says, this may have not been how it happened. Francis Collins, in his book, The Language of Science and Faith, which I've been drawing upon and drawing a little bit upon today's message from, Francis Collins says this: what we know about the complexity of the building blocks of life, including DNA, RNA, amino acids, sugars, no adequate hypothesis for the spontaneous origin of life has yet to be found. Think about that. We really have no answer for that the life spontaneously happened. Now, that doesn't mean that science won't one day discover how that happened, So I don't want us to go too far down that track, but the reality is we really don't understand how life happened on this planet. And there is the other possibility that other folks have suggested, and that is that, well, if life didn't start here on this planet, maybe it came by way of meteorite, and a meteorite came and landed here in the waters of this planet, and then that carried with it life. But the question still remains, doesn't it? How do we get from inorganic life to life? How do you get from the creation of the universe, inorganic matter, to life happening on a planet? And even if it's from another meteorite, we still have the same question, don't we? We still have to think about, okay, well, how did it happen on that planet? You see, it's just the question is the same, it's just a different location now. Does that make sense? And so we still have to wrestle with this. How does this happen? And we don't have a good answer. So what else does science have to say? I want to unpack a little bit more about this planet and how life happened on this planet. Anybody know how old the Earth is? Anybody want to take a guess? According to science, how old is the Earth? We don't, there's estimates out there. The science community says the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old, the planet. And they get that from going down to the Earth's crust, taking a sample of the Earth's crust, and then dating it using uranium as an isotope. And I don't even want to go into explaining that because I don't understand it. I just know it's more accurate than carbon dating. So that's all we need to know. So they've estimated about 4.5 billion years. The other thing that's kind of interesting is that we actually have ice. They do these ice core. I don't know if you've heard about the core drilling. They go to the South Pole, North Pole, and they drill down the ice and they count the layers, and they can actually see what the weather was like, predict what the weather was like in a particular year based on what's happening in the ice and what's present in the ice. It's pretty fascinating. But they've got ice core samples that date back about 740,000 years ago. They have these ice samples. And so we can say we've got ice on the planet that's at least 740,000 years old from ice layers. We also know that in Germany there are trees that are over 10,000 years old. So however we look at it, we realize that the Earth's been around for a long time. I think that's the bottom line, isn't it? We can debate how old or young or whatever, but it's been around for a long time, a lot longer than we think. The other thing that's amazing about life here on the planet is that science says that life started to come about on the planet at about 3.8 billion years ago. But it was just like in bacterial form for a long time, for about 3 billion years. So think about that. So for a long time, there was no complex, I don't want to say bacteria or cells aren't complex, they are. But there were no forms of life like you and I, what we see today. And then about 543 million years ago, according to scientists and archaeologists, life just exploded on the planet. And we can't explain why. We can't explain why all of a sudden life just popped on this planet. Plants came into being, animals came into being, trees came into being, fish came into being, crustaceans came into being. All these life forms start to just emerge all of a sudden. And there's no explanation for why that happened. The other thing that's amazing, here's the amazing thing. There are 10 million species of plants and animals on this planet today. And some of them are actually living within your body. You want to hear something a little creepy? Do you ever watch the Dr. Oz? Do you ever see Dr. Oz, and they take the women's purses and then they take samples off the bottom of the purse, or they take the sample off the lip and they go see what kind of bacteria is living on these things, and they just gross everybody out. Have you ever seen this? Am I the only one that saw that Dr. Oz? Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay. So they freak you out by saying, so now we've got, what do? We keep sanitary wipes everywhere we go. We're using impact, we're freaking out about everything. If you haven't seen the movie Contagion, you're really going to freak out. So anyway, all this is going on, right? And here's the creepy thing. This is going to gross you out. Do you know that for every living cell in your body, there's about 10 bacteria in your body? So you've actually got more bacteria living within you and I than we have cells in our bodies. It's all in there. And it's amazing that we keep living with it, right? We're still alive. We survived the bacteria. Some are worse than others. So anyway, there's all this life that's happening on this planet, and we can't explain it. We can't explain it. The other thing that's amazing to me is that this planet seems to be finely tuned for life to occur on it. It seems as though this planet was positioned at just the right distance, not only from the sun, but in the entire galaxy. Remember we talked about galaxies last week and how many there were? But think about this. The Earth, the planet, is not only in the right position from the sun and in the solar system, but it's in the right position within the galaxy, what they call the habitable zone in the galaxy. It's tilted at just the right angle for life to occur. It has H2O, water, which is necessary for life. In fact, there are about 20 different factors that are required for a planet to have life, and we just happen to have all 20. And out of the billions of stars and planets in the universe, so far, we're the only ones that have all 20 factors, our planet. Doesn't mean another one won't be discovered. It just means for what we know today is we're the only one. We're the only one that has the ability, this planet is the only one that has the ability for life to exist. The other crazy thing about it is that there are multiple forces at work within the universe. And I won't unpack all those for you either this morning. If you gave me another 10 minutes, we'd talk about strong nuclear force and weak nuclear force and all these wonderful things that you want to hear about, I know, right? But I want to talk about one that you do know about, and that's the force of gravity. Now, gravity is a blessing and a curse. The curse is that when we get on the scale tomorrow morning, gravity will work very well, won't it? So imagine that you get on the scale tomorrow, and let's say overnight we could adjust gravity. We could change the force of gravity, and we could change how it's tuned in our universe, and we could make it so that when you got on the scale tomorrow morning, you actually weigh less than you do today. How many people would like to do that? Would that be good? Okay. Would it be nice to get on that scale tomorrow morning and it's just like it's saying a whole lot less than it does today? If we could change gravity, wouldn't that be nice, we think? But if we changed it, and let's say you got on the scale tomorrow morning and gravity had changed overnight, and let's say that you only weighed 1/1000th of a gram less than you do today, you'd be like, oh, well, that's no good. That doesn't do them any good, does it? It won't even be perceived by the scale. That slight change, if we were to change the force of gravity by 1/1000th of a gram, life would not exist. If the law of gravity changed that slightly, imperceptibly. In fact, if we weighed lighter, the universe would not exist. And if we weighed 1/1000th of a gram more by the law of gravity, again, the universe would not exist. It would have all just converged upon itself. Something about the way that this universe and this planet is finely tuned for life to exist. So as I look at the science, I start to say, it's almost as if somebody wanted us here. It's almost as if we were meant to happen. That's my interpretation, not necessarily science's interpretation. So let's move and look at what the Bible has to say this morning. It's on the back of your bulletins, and it was a long reading this morning. I know a little bit longer than usual. But it's, where do you cut it off, Like, do we cut off at day 3? Do we cut off at day 5? Where are we going to cut where are we going to cut it off? You got to read the whole thing. So we look at this, and this chapter in Genesis was written. And it was written down from an oral tradition. And that meant that this whole passage was memorized and passed on from generation to generation. So if you wanted to memorize something, what would you do to help you memorize a long passage like this? How would you basically write it or put it together if you knew someone was going to have to memorize it? What would you do with it? What would you build into it? Stay with me. You got it. I think you're coming up. What would you do? What helps us remember? What did you hear? Did I hear repetition over here? Repetition. That's exactly what's going on in the text, isn't it? Did you hear the repetition? There's a lot of repetition because it was meant to be memorized. It was meant to be passed on from one generation to another generation. You know, just like Goldilocks and the Three Bears, we all know that because we've memorized it, we've been taught it, and it's repetitive, isn't it? And so that's what's going on here. There's this repetition. And so I want to just draw on a couple things about repetition this morning. There are two things that is true in every day. Actually, three things, but the two I want to focus on is, one is it says, God said, let there be, or let the. So that's the first part, repeated in every day. The other thing it says, and God saw that it was good. So there's this let there be, this command of God, and then there's this God who steps back and says, hey, that's good. That's really good. It's almost as though God were kind of supervising the process rather than really getting dirty, getting hands-on here. Does that make any sense? It's like God says, let there be, and then this thing, whatever part of that day is, comes into existence, and then God steps back and says, oh, that's good. Yeah, I like that. That's really good. Well, let's move on to the next part. And God said, and then this piece comes into existence. So let's take a look at that. Can we pull that up, Larry, this morning, just the days? So the next should be in the next slide. So here's what happens on, so there's the let there be, and God saw that it was good. So day one, what happens on day one? Light, right? Light comes into existence. Day two, we've got the sea and the sky. We've got the atmosphere being created and coming into existence from the waters on the earth, the sea. Day three, we've got the land and also plants and vegetation coming up on day three. Okay? So here's the first 3 days. Now, I want you to notice something on day four. Day four, we get the sun, moon, and the stars. What does day four have any, does day four have any relationship to day one? Do you see the relationship? The light in day four is talking more specifically about the lights. So my question is, there's also another piece that's repeated in the text. It says, and there was morning and there was evening on the first day. And there was morning and there was evening on the second day. Here's my question. How was there morning and evening on the first day, the second day, and the third day when we did not yet have sun, moon, and stars? Just a question. That if we begin to look at Genesis with linear thought, or take it linearly, we miss it. We miss the point of Genesis, is what I'm saying. The author, when the author wrote this, I think the author was well aware that as they wrote this and as they put this together, that this was not to be taken as linear and literal. But I think the author understood that. And I'll explain a little bit more about that in a minute. Day 5, fish and birds. Do you see any relationship to day 2? And then what do you think happens on day 6? Day 6, animals and humans. And is there any relationship to day 3? Okay? So do you see how these days relate to each other? Now, go back to your bulletins. And I want you to look at the very first verse of Genesis chapter 1, the very first line. Let's read just those first 6 words together. You ready? Read with me out loud. The earth was formless and empty. 6 words. There you go. That's right. That's right. Keep them straight over there, all right? 6 words. Formless. You hear that? Formless. Empty. What do the first 3 days do about form? Being formless. Forms light and darkness. Forms the sea and sky. Forms the land from the sea. What do days 4, 5, and 6 have to do with being empty? Day 4 filled the heavens with the sun, the moon, and stars. Day 5 filled the seas and the skies with fish and birds. And day 6 filled the land with animals and humans. You see another pattern now in Genesis? That God was creating a habitable place for us. That there was a purpose behind this. That it was empty and it was formless, but God was the one giving it form and filling it with these beings and these animals and these creatures, and specifically for us. This was become a habitable place. And this planet lives in a habitable zone within the galaxy and within the solar system. It's as though God wanted us here in this place. And that God was, again, the who that was creating and the purpose for what Genesis is looking at, the who and for what purpose. Remember, science helps us understand the how. So to help us understand this a little bit more, I've actually invited Paul Behrens to share. Paul Behrens, our lay leader. I think I saw Paul come in here this morning. There he is. He's hiding. And Paul to come up here and share with us this morning. Paul is not only the lay leader here at Glenmar United Methodist Church, but you also know that Paul has a PhD in biological sciences from the great University of Maryland. And so, did I say great? They didn't respond to that. So Paul also is adjunct faculty over at UMBC, and he's also the co-founder and director over at Martech Biological Sciences, which is a local company here. And actually, you all won received a presidential award for small businesses here in the United States just last year. That's right.
Hall of Fame.
Right, the Hall of Fame. Down at the White House. Very good. So I've asked Paul to come as a scientist and also as a person of faith to come and share this morning. And so Paul, I'm going to confess to you, I changed the questions from last night. So you're
Well, guess what? I'll change the answer.
There you go. No, but I think we're on the same track. The first one is, in general, how do you, as a biologist, how do you see life coming into existence here on the planet? How do you see that happening in general?
I mean, that's a hard question. That's basically a lot of what you've talked about this morning. How did life come into being? As a biologist, and I work with living organisms, microorganisms in particular, the more we learn about them, the more we understand how little we really know. The more we learn, progressively we understand more, but the more we understand, there comes a point where we just can't explain why things happen the way they did or where they came from in the first place.
And how do you think that God, I mean, as you look at the biology and life on the planet, do you also see how God may have been involved with that process, or how does God come together for you with the science? Is there any way to help that?
Well, in my opinion, I don't think you can be a scientist and not believe in God. Because the more I learn, the more I see, the more I understand, the more questions there are. And as I said, there comes a point where you just can't explain things without God being the one there who created it. I think that, actually, as a scientist, I think it's made my faith stronger. Because, as I said, the more I learn, the more I know I don't know. And that just leads to a greater deepening of my faith and my belief in God as a creator of all the things that we have here.
So what's the most amazing thing that you've seen in your area, field of science, that says, oh, there has to be a creator? Is there anything that you've learned along the way that you say, oh, you look at it and you go, oh man, there's got to be a God?
Well, it's not only working with the microorganisms, but even last week when you were talking about the stars and all that, no matter how far you go back and learn and understand, there gets to be a point where you simply can't explain it anymore. Now, maybe as time goes on, science will learn more and understand more. But what I expect will happen is we'll always get to a point where we can't explain it. And that science is completely compatible with a belief in God. I have absolutely no doubt about that. The two are not, it's not either or, it's and. God created, and the scientist is here to help explain and understand. In fact, there's two schools of thought, two philosophies of science. One is that the universe is chaotic, and that scientists exist to bring order to that chaos. And the other, which I particularly happen to believe, is that the universe is ordered. God created order, and all the scientist does is discover it and understand it. But God created it all and put it all here.
Yeah, that's great. So last question is, what would you say to someone who may be struggling to make sense of science and religion, or science and faith, and either going one way or the other? what would you say? What would you say to maybe help a person to see the relationship that you just he did a great job of explaining that, didn't he? The order and understanding the order. So what would you advice or counsel would you give someone who may be struggling with that?
Well, I think the place to start, it's not one or the other.
Right.
I mean, I think the two are completely compatible. I mean, God created humans to be inquisitive, to want to understand, to experiment, and to be able to discover and understand all that God has created. So I don't see that it's a matter of you have to decide, I believe in science or I believe in God. I think the two are completely compatible. And as I said, I think by being a scientist, it's actually helped me grow in my faith, and I think I have a stronger belief in God because of it.
Wow, that's pretty good. Let's give Paul a hand. Thank you, Paul. I love what Paul said. His faith is stronger because of the science, not weaker. And I think one of the things, the messages that the world is sending us out there in the secular world is that science is moving people away from God. And I think what Paul just said is an excellent point, that science doesn't have to move us away from God. It can actually move us towards God, depending on how we study and understand it. So I want to leave you with this thought about this miraculous planet. And the thought is this, I want you to imagine for a moment with me that you're blindfolded and you're tied to a post in a courtyard. And you've been taken before a firing squad. Okay, blindfolded, tied to a post so you can't move. You're about to be shot by a firing squad. Now, the firing squad is made up of men and women who are expert marksmen and with the latest weaponry, the most accurate devices. And the commander of the guard gives the command to fire. And each gun is aimed at you, and the word fire is heard, and the guns go off, and a couple seconds later, you're still alive. Not a single bullet has hit you. They come and they untie you from the post, and they're taking you back to your holding cell. How do you respond to what just happened? Do you shrug your shoulders and go, wow, that must be my lucky day? Is that your response? Or is your response a lot of questions? Like, how did that happen? Did someone orchestrate that? Is there some other person at work here that may have saved my life? Or why am I still here? Maybe there's a purpose to my life. Maybe somebody wants me here. And maybe the response at that moment really is gratitude, isn't it? And praise, and thankfulness, and questions about what am I supposed to do now with the rest of my life? Amen.
It's a humbling thought to think that we are